Climbing Gold is brought to you by The North Face. Never stop exploring. Koros, performance sports technology. Element, restoring health through hydration. Henson Shaving, buy once, use for life. And Altitude Climbing, level up your climbing.
Alex, do you remember the first time you met Cory Richards?
I actually don't remember the first time we met necessarily, but I do remember our first shoot together, which was in Yosemite. He shot me on Astroman. It was basically right after I free soloed Astroman in the rostrum for the first time. Mm-hmm. And I was like just appearing on the radar of climbing, whatever that means. Mm-hmm. I think he was the first professional photographer I ever took pictures with. Yeah,
it's funny because you guys probably had a career that was super intertwined because he was at that moment, like he was starting really out on his photo career as well and his professional climbing career, right?
Yeah. He's maybe a few years older than me, but we were basically at the same point where we were kind of just starting off at roughly the same time. And I think we definitely were on the same point in the curve where you're young and hungry and you're fired up and you just want to do something, like prove yourself in some way. Cory really found his niche with high altitude mountaineering, with mountain climbing. I mean, he's the first American to climb an 8,000 meter peak in winter, which is heinous because it's so cold. And then he's also climbed Everest without oxygen and Snapchatted his way up it. That was a hashtag Everest No Filter with Adrian Bollinger. That generated something like 1 billion social media impressions. It's like something insane. It was a total moment for Snapchat.
Yeah.
One of his strengths as a photographer is being able to access positions that many other photographers can't, and then get shots that other photographers can't necessarily. And so I think in a lot of ways, because I've always felt like that's really Jimmy Chin's strength as a photographer, is just being able to keep up with people and get into crazy positions at the right time. And I feel like Cory definitely has that same kind of talent, except I dare say Cory might be more of a natural artist. Like he loves the art more, and he's more like creative in some ways, with all respect to Jimmy, because obviously Jimmy's an incredible photographer. But I think Cory is just, I don't know, he just like lives more flamboyantly for whatever that means. You know what I mean? Like he just like really is an artist.
I remember this summer, and you sort of said it in this way that it's like Cory's kind of like has the bizarro version of my life. And it was like, what if I had made all the opposite choices in my life? What did you mean by that?
I've known Cory a long time. We're good friends. I'm trying to think how to say it diplomatically, but he's just gone so big and then just imploded over and over. I'm kind of like, man, I think my whole, if I want to call it a career, it's all just been kind of slow and steady, gentle build, like all pretty healthy. And like Cory's just gets so big and then explodes, and then he builds it back up again and then explodes. And you're just like, wow. It's as if I always made the wrong choice. Like, with all the same opportunities, but I always just did the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's what makes the memoir so interesting, is you're like, oh, he's had so much good fortune and so much bad fortune. It's like multiple lives in one. I mean, it's incredible.
So through this all, Cory is living with bipolar disorder. There was the avalanche on Gashabrum 2, where he snapped this incredible photo, which ends up on the cover of National Geographic and really like launches his career. But with that also came PTSD and a deepening struggle with alcoholism and sex addiction. His marriage fell apart. He lost sponsorships. Eventually, he had a mental breakdown on Everest. And actually, his final expedition, he had to like very, very suddenly leave and basically gave up climbing. And it has been a journey back for Cory to be able to process this. And these 2 books he's created, The Color of Everything and Bipolar Images from an Unquiet Mind, are a reflection of that journey and really a search for like understanding of what's happened to him and the choices he's made, because he doesn't seem to hide behind his mental health issues.
I think that's what made The Color of Everything so powerful to me, was how unflinching it is. He just lays it all out. It's such a crazy read. It's like people should just read it because it's such a wild story.
Yeah. There's a lot of wisdom in it. And it comes from like a pretty imperfect narrator who's okay with being imperfect.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's what a journey.
Yeah.
I'm Alex Honnold.
I'm Fitz Cahall.
This is Climbing Gold.
The Color of Everything is memoir, and it sort of uses climbing and adventure in some ways a through line, but really it's about mental health. So I always describe it as like a 3-layer onion, where the outer layer is my life story, which literally starts at birth and then goes through this very tumultuous sort of adolescence that is where I start this journey with mental health. And then it goes into climbing and sort of through dropping out of high school and homelessness, and then rediscovering climbing, and then discovering photography, and then letting that all go. So the second layer of that onion is mental health and the dissection of the brain and how it develops and why we do the things we do, and how really all behavior is an expression of some degree of belief that we've created through storytelling. And then the central layer of that onion is basically that everything we do is storytelling. Consciousness itself is storytelling. And sometimes those stories they can hold us captive, or, we can change them and they can set us free from a lifetime of, limiting beliefs that keep us trapped.
So I read an advanced reader copy of your book early on, and then I passed it to my wife because I was like, this is an incredible book. I needed to talk about it with somebody. So I passed it to my wife. She read it. And then we both talked about it extensively. So we were like, wow, there's a lot here. But it's interesting to hear you describe the 3 layers of the story. Because I'm like, I think I completely missed the central, like the core of what you're saying, which is that it's all storytelling on the inside.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I just got so hung up in the outrageous story and the crazy events, like the literal. I mean, and it's not surprising that I personally got hung up on the literal, like, what are you doing and where and who and, with whom.
Yeah.
But it's just like, it's such a crazy tale.
I mean, of course, you have your endemic audience, and you want the climbing community to lean into it and read it. But at the same time, I always was like, this isn't a climbing book, and it was never meant to be a climbing book. It was never even meant to be like an adventure memoir in any way. And
except that it is also.
It is.
I mean,
it has to be, right. It leans into that.
Yeah, because you've had so many adventures. I mean, how can you not?
Right. So you use that as the hook to leverage to get people into that meatier stuff that hopefully lets them sort of, the biggest compliment is, wow, it made me think.
Yeah, well, definitely gave us a conversation piece for like 2 weeks. It was like a full debate topic. In some ways, I don't want to give too many spoilers to the book because people should just read The Color of Everything. Great book, and I think they'll take their own opinions from it. But can you give us the rough breakdown of your life? I guess. I mean, it's hard to give the 2-minute version, but give us the things that you think are important.
Basically, born in Salt Lake City. Mom takes me to see a therapist when I'm 1 year old, like a psychologist, because she thinks something's like off. Maybe she wasn't wrong. But that really starts this journey with mental health. I was a gifted kid. I was very bright, but I was also very sort of mercurial and tumultuous as a child. And then this dynamic between my brother and I started to evolve, where there was a lot of violence, physical violence, emotional violence, mostly aimed in my direction. And yet we both learned that, in order to get certain needs met and get the attention that we were craving for whatever reason, because of certain family dynamics between my mom, my dad, all of us, my brother learned that violence was a great way to get attention. And I learned that getting the shit kicked out of me was a great way to get attention. So now we've got this cyclical pattern that's reinforcing violence and victimhood in the household. And by virtue of that, because I was generally speaking on the receiving end of it, even as I was feeding into it, that alienated my brother, and it focused a huge amount of attention on me. But also that attention was not without reason, because it basically, at that point, I was sort of, I was falling off the rails. I went to high school 2 years early. And after, 7th and 8th grade, I dropped out. I ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a week where they, I'd been put on Prozac when I was 12. And then I ended up in a long-term inpatient, outpatient treatment facility for about 8 months. I ran away 3 times. And then I didn't have a place to go. So I was sort of on the streets, right? I ended up living in Seattle with my aunt and uncle, which is where I rediscovered climbing. And I first picked up a camera, and I was 17 at the time. And that was sort of when I started to get drawn back into climbing, and also using the camera as sort of an expression of what I was feeling inside. And then I went headlong into that for a very long time, and climbing being an extension of that, or photography being an extension of climbing, I got better at it. And I was smart enough to align myself and get along with and really have deep friendships with really amazing climbers, because it was a symbiotic relationship, which got me invited on bigger and bigger things, got sponsored. Then I went to Gashabrum 2 in the winter with Simone Moro and Dennis Arupco in 2010-11, became the first American to summit an 8,000 meter peak in winter, and then got hit by an avalanche on the way down, took a photograph, and that launched, like that was like rocket fuel to my career. And that's where the book starts, is kind of in the middle, but also because that's where there was a fracture and pieces of me, because of all the childhood stuff, started to express through different adaptations, and also when I was 14, I was diagnosed with bipolar 2. So there was that. How was that?
Yes. So I'm just like, oh my God. And this is really my experience reading the book, is that at every point I'm like, whoa, so let's unpack some things. And like, but actually, I mean, I'm sort of interested in the fact that you feel like your experience on Gashabrum 2, that was the turning point in your career, you think, professionally? Because I see your career as sort of a long, slow, steady arc, because I remember the film with The Cold and I mean, the iconic photo of you just after the avalanche that was widely seen everywhere. But then after that, you had, Everest No Filter and your crazy hair and, like all kinds of other projects and then a bunch of big Nat Geo expeditions. And I suppose from the outside, and I've known you a long time, but sort of casually, run into you at events and things. And I feel like it's just been this steady snowball where it's like, oh, your whole career is like gaining steam and just like taking off. But I'm curious, do you really see the winter expedition to G2 as a sort of an inflection point?
I think it's an inflection point because to that point, all of the expeditions were sort of small, and they were, you're right, they were getting bigger and bigger. So there was a build, but because of that photo and because of Cold, that was my entree into like assignment work for National Geographic. Mm. And because that photo was put on the cover of National Geographic, it was a moment where, there was, I don't want to say undue, but there was a lot of attention that on me that allowed for the acceleration of my career. Mm-hmm. And so it was only after that I started working for National Geographic, and then as Cold came out and that one Banff, and it launched life in a very specific way. And yet it was also the same point where, years later, I'd be like, oh shit, this is what people refer to as PTSD. This is what I'm experiencing that's sort of part of the book, is that this internal tension between what's happening externally and what's going on internally. And the further I got from the honesty of my internal landscape as a projection sort of to compensate for it externally, the more and more unhappy I got. It to the point where it was just constant, not constant, but it would be these cycles of build, burn down, build, burn down, build, burn. You know what I mean?
Well, that's what makes the book such fascinating reading, is that you achieve such success, and then every time you burn it down, and then you achieve great success, and then you burn it down. But that's kind of what, to me, was at the core of the book, is like how much of this is stuff that happens to you and how much is stuff that you choose, and what's the sort of tension between that.
Well, I think that is again, you're hitting at one of the things that really, I think, is one of the most important issues of the book and mental health in general. Is especially today, we see people getting diagnosed and then it becomes this identity. And in that way, oftentimes people hide behind this diagnosis as a way to excuse behavior. And I am a very, very firm believer that a diagnosis is just information. It's just a framework to understand why people behave in certain ways. But still, at the end of the day, I would say the vast majority of mental health complications still provide room for agency. And agency and responsibility is that's what living in integrity is taking on that responsibility and taking on that agency and owning the decisions you make. But I will be very clear that for a long time, I was one of those people that, even though I could speak to mental health, I was still in some ways kind of hiding behind it and almost thinking that, like, by the struggles I had, I was somehow special, and that diagnosis gave me some level of license to be an asshole, or not, I mean, be an asshole in life. But if you, I think really diving deeper into that, there's a reason why I was making decisions that ultimately burned it down every time. You know what I mean? Like there was a reason that I was doing that. And I think the reason, again, all of this is guessing in some ways, but my best guess is that I just didn't feel like I was worthy of the success. And that comes from childhood, developmental stuff where, you're sort of learning these things about yourself. When there's violence, you're learning value. You're creating questions of value, right? Like, well, if I'm getting beat up, like, and I don't feel protected, like, then I must not matter. And that seems very reductive, but those are core beliefs that we develop. And so later in life, when I'm getting this success, there's some sort of dark piece of me that's like, yeah, but you don't deserve it.
Yeah. Though it's interesting because I think everybody feels that to some extent. I mean, I certainly have experienced those same feelings, probably to a different degree. But I think anyone that achieves any success always have moments of like,
imposter syndrome.
Like, am I worth it? Yeah, exactly. Imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
But it just seems like it's heightened because of the background, because of the challenges in life.
Yeah.
But can you get specific about the sort of trauma of the avalanche on G2? Basically, so like, how does that trauma manifest itself? Like, how does that actually play out in day-to-day life for you? You know what I mean? And how did that affect your future expeditions and things?
So really quick, I'll just break. This is very, very reductive, but it's a basic understanding of what trauma does, like PTSD, what happens. So when we have a near-death experience or a traumatic experience for that matter, and it can be anything, it can be a car accident. It really can. It's not reserved for battlefields. That's how we generally see it, or historically. What happens is there's a immediate stress response that is triggered by the amygdala, right? And when that's going on, it basically shuts down the prefrontal cortex, and so you're in fight, flight, or freeze, right? And in trauma, that experience gets basically, think of it like getting lodged in the hippocampus. So anything, even the most minute things, can trigger that memory. So an observation of something, whatever it happens to be. For me, it was like an airplane going overhead. I'd hear this rumble and I would look up. I could be in the middle of like the plains, and I would look and be like, what the fuck is that? So it gets lodged in the hippocampus, which is the memory center. Again, it's not this cut and dry. And then it triggers the amygdala again. So you go right back into fight, flight, or freeze. And so basically your whole prefrontal cortex shuts down, and there's actually evidence that shows that its efficacy over time diminishes because you're just living back and forth in this slingshot of memory and you're
triggering the response.
Yeah. So when the avalanche, for me, the way that manifested, and again, it's important to understand that when you have a lot of developmental trauma, you're more likely to experience an episode of acute PTSD, which is why some people experience it and some people don't. So for me in my life, what that was a hyper irritability that, on top of that being sort of a symptom of bipolar 2, it's like a gnawing anxiety, just that it's kind of like you're always trying to shrug it off. You know what I mean? And then because of that, there's this irritability that can lead to anger. There was profound memory loss. There's sort of a dissociation where, for whatever reason, different triggers make you just kind of like shut down, and you're completely dissociated both from your body, and you're just sort of hung in your mind, right? And so because of that, all of those things taking place and that discomfort in my body, there were behaviors that are really just coping mechanisms or modalities to circumvent that, like move around it. And a lot of those, that's why substance abuse is so prevalent in people who have gone through traumatic experiences, because they're literally trying to just shut down that slingshot thing. They're trying to zone out. And that can be your screen, it could be gaming, it can be sex. For me, it was really sex and alcohol. And also, I would say that it was work. It was climbing itself that became a maladaptive coping mechanism because it was a pure distraction. But the interesting thing with that is that then you're putting yourself directly back into the scenario or situation that brought it all up to begin with. So you're constantly in an overexposure therapy system. And it just wears you fucking down over time to the point where you're living in such stress that the only inevitability, the only possible outcome is collapse.
Yeah. So how did that play out in your mountaineering exploits post G2, like after Gashabrum 2?
After G2, there was, there were some big Everest trips.
Which is Everest No Filter, which is like huge on, what was it on? Oh, Snapchat.
Was
You guys went
Snapchat.
huge on Snapchat. Yeah, like what, you guys had like 1 billion impressions on Snapchat or something?
2.5 billion impressions, which was absolutely bonkers for, we weren't doing anything really that unique in terms of the climbing.
Well, you did climb Everest with no oxygen, right?
Right. So in 2016.
So that's, it's a good effort.
It's a good, yeah. I mean, we climbed Everest without oxygen by the standard route on the north side. I don't want to diminish it, but like also for a climbing audience, I want to be very clear that, this was not like a groundbreaking ascent.
Yeah, it wasn't cutting edge, but it's still pretty proud.
It's proud, yeah, and I'm very proud of it. But we used Snapchat to tell this sort of real-time live storytelling, Adrian Ballinger and I, and and we started trending, and then it just absolutely blew up. Then in 2018, I kind of took a year off and started training for a new route. Topo and I were going to try to do a new route on Everest on the Northeast Face, which we tried in 2019, spent an open bivvy just below 25,000 feet, which was so heinous. And then the next day started climbing up, the wind closed in and we descended. Cut to COVID, train again for 2 years. Everest season gets canceled. We decide to try a new route on the Northwest Ridge face of Dhaulagiri. We go, and I have a mixed bipolar episode at base camp, and I shock the whole team. And I was just like, I'm fucking done with this, all of it. And I just walked away. But to give some context, when in bipolar 2 and bipolar in general, when you're in an episode, the speed with which you think, so these racing thoughts, they are so torrential and so fast that it's jarring and can be sort of discombobulating. There's a tremendous amount of noise in your brain. So the thoughts that are recycling might be very, very normal thoughts about like, I'm going to die, this is too day, but the speed with which they're happening and the exchange that they're going through, for me, back and forth between, sort of almost elation and grandiosity and this deep despair that is, yes, preoccupied by the climbing, but has nothing to do with rational fear, is an indicator that something is a jar or a miss in the brain.
So you're describing your mental state felt like class 5 rapids instead of a placid pool. Because I'm like, that is a good description. Because I'm like, when I'm at base camp and I look up at something and I'm filled with fear, my internal the speed of my thoughts is still like a placid pool. It's still like very slow. You look up and you're like, wow. That's scary, but it's still kind of peaceful in its own way. And so what you're describing is like a raging torrent of nonstop, just like bouncing back and forth.
Bouncing back and forth to the point where it makes no sense, to the point where, I'm hunched over, bent over in my tent, absolutely sobbing, like because I'm so exhausted by it, but also I haven't slept. So I can't eat. Of course, if somebody doesn't sleep for 3 days, they're going to start hallucinating like they're on acid. This wasn't that. And yet they do precipitate each other. And I guess what I would say is that when your mind has a predisposition to lapse into these states, that's, I think, the delineation where it's normal to in sleep deprivation, to lose your appetite. But it's not necessarily normal to tip into a hypomanic or a manic state that then persists, right? In the other case, you eat or you sleep eventually and you sort of regulate. In this case, the regulation doesn't come. And that's what I was realizing is, this is speeding up to the point where I can't control it. Obviously, there's an awareness around it, but even in that, the awareness is also, if I don't get this under control, there's a potential for a psychotic break, which is what can happen in mania. I've never experienced full-blown mania, but I was so fearful of that in this moment. And also, part of it was just realizing that I was so fucking stressed out because of the life I was living. I had not stopped. I had not stopped in years. I would been on the road for 9 months out of the year for the better part of a decade, and sort of avoiding a lot of what my internal dialogue was saying, which was, dude, I don't want to fucking do this anymore. Like, part of the beauty and terror of my mind is that I create scenarios constantly that tend to be the worst case. So I'm training for Everest for a year and a half, and I'm literally basically in an 18-month meditation on my own mortality. And that's exhausting work, right? Whereas somebody like you, I'd imagine, yes, you're having those thoughts. You're gearing up for the big free solo on El Cap, right? But your management of those things is more regulated, and you're more capable of holding that space and also not ruminating. So rumination, being a part of the bipolar or ADHD mind, sort of can get you stuck in these thought cycles.
We'll be back with more after the break. I've been a North Face athlete for almost 18 years, which has been incredible, and I've always appreciated their commitment to exploration. Summit Series is the name of the pinnacle North Face products that I use on every expedition, and I love that their tagline is athlete tested and expedition proven. I've personally tested these products all over the world, and they've always proven themselves. Future Fleece is the next generation base layer that I wear almost every day of climbing outside, whether on the wall or at the crag. You can shop the full Summit Series collection at thenorthface.com. What do you think is the biggest obstacle that holds back most climbers? It's not strength, it's not technique, and it's not how hard they try. It's fear. It's fear of falling, fear of getting injured, fear of the unknown. Hazel Finlay has already helped thousands of climbers overcome that fear. Now she's teamed up with Altitude, Magnus Bitbo's climbing platform, for her new online course that will help you eliminate your fear of falling in just 6 weeks. For some climbers, the fear of falling is overwhelming and obvious. Your body freezes up, your mind runs wild, your hands get sweaty, and you worry about all the possible scenarios. But for most climbers, fear can be a lot more subtle. To learn more about the 7 signs that the fear of falling is affecting your climbing, and to enroll in Hazel's brand new course to overcome that fear, head to altitudeclimbing.com/climbinggold. Like a lot of people, I shave regularly, and I care about high-quality, durable products. That's where Henson Shaving comes in. Their razors are built on groundbreaking research on the impact that shaving has on your skin. Disposable razors are not only bad for the environment, they can also cause a lot more skin irritation. Henson razors are built to provide a skin-friendly shave. They're machined to have less bend and flex so that the blade doesn't move while you're shaving, which gives you more control. Plus, there are no gimmicks like moisturizing strips or subscriptions. It's time to say no to subscriptions and yes to a razor that'll last you a lifetime. Visit hensonshaving.com/climbinggold to select the razor for you and use code climbinggold to get 2 years worth of free blades with your razor. Just make sure to add them to your cart. That's 100 free blades when you head to hensonshaving.com/climbinggold and use the code climbinggold. I was thinking about the whole, basically you're the almost cliche of the tortured artist,
Right.
Like the extreme productivity, like super bright, burning super fast. And I feel like the sort of final third of your book is your journey to sort of pace yourself a little bit, slow things down, like find some control over your mind and I don't know, rein in a little bit. And I'm curious if you think that kind of mania is required for the artistic output that you were creating. You know what I mean? Or like, can you be chill and still do the things that you have done in the past?
Well, I think it's just such a great question. And I do deconstruct the tortured artist trope in the book, where I say, look, like there's a myth here that needs to be deconstructed. Yes, oftentimes there's an overlap between specifically bipolar and the creative mind and the creative temperament. But because of that, and through time, we've built a sort of an archetype of the tortured artist, which is very, very seductive, right? Because not
Totally.
only does it excuse being tortured and allows people to sit in that, but in fact, it encourages it because it becomes an identity. And so there's a belief that's formed around that identity that I have to be fucked up to make meaningful things. I do not agree with that. I believe that it requires a huge amount of effort and self-reflection to change that narrative. And I think that can be very hard. And I think that's a journey a lot of people don't want to take because it's very effortful, right? It's uncomfortable. And once you build an identity, it's very fucking hard to leave it behind.
In my own limited way, I mean, I've sort of dealt with the same thing, just the sort of dark artist with soloing. It's like, do you need to be super angstful to free solo at a high level? Do you need to be,
right,
upset about your life to push hard and perform well? And, in obviously in a totally different scale than what you describe in your book. But I would say my personal journey over the last 10 years has been kind of, can I still do hard things while living a peaceful, happy life with stable relationships and now a family? It's like,
what do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think because that's kind of the thing in a lot of ways. I think, at least for me, stability gives you more of the framework you need to succeed at a high level. It's like stability allows you to train consistently, to not implode all the time. Because I think, I definitely in my 20s, I did a lot of the same, well, not the same kind of self-destructive behavior that you've done, but the same kind of self-sabotage, like binging on desserts or just festering on rest days and things, kind of going into a dark hole on rest days where you're like, why am I even alive? Like, if I'm not climbing today, this is totally stupid. And I think that just doesn't help you be the best version of you. It certainly doesn't help you succeed in any of the things you're doing. And I think that a big part of, sort of adulthood for me is figuring out how to still do hard things without all the emotional baggage around it.
I totally agree. I believe that if you are using torture and pain as a mechanism to create, you have a far more limited capacity to do so. And that burnout can manifest in self-sabotage, in burning it all down, burning the success down. And you also make a really good point about structure. Structure is actually freedom. And when you create a framework of structure around your life, you have more energy because you're not blowing it. You're not like, it's like not off-gassing in all sorts of directions. You're more able to direct it. But I think in some ways there's a beauty in living in the sort of that accelerated state and burning out, because it leads you to that place. Look, you never see somebody really successful who's balanced, but they learn to balance the imbalance with the quiet, and they put structure around it. So they're learning to leverage and channel that energy into creativity by building structure to create freedom. It's all paradoxical. It's all sort of counterintuitive at times. And I think that the other component of this is that for myself, because of some of these internal beliefs that I had in these stories I was telling, I was oftentimes mistaking attention for love, right? And so I needed more and more and more and more and more of it. And that required that I burned bigger, hotter, faster, more often to generate the sense of value that I was so deeply lacking.
That's interesting. I mean, did that work?
It never works. It works for a time. It always works for a time. You've got and I was never wealthy, but like people get a mountain of cash. They have limitless resources to whatever they want. So the distraction, and people always want to be around them. People are drawn to fame like a moth to a flame. It is fucking crazy that, how much people want to be around that. And when that happens, the person who's at the center of it basically has a hall pass to ignore real life. And they're giving themselves that hall pass. But eventually, as I found, that it was complete, it was a bottomless void. I always use it's like pouring water in a cracked vessel. Eventually the crack's gonna get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's gonna break. You cannot fill it up. It will never be full. But like any drug, when you first do it, it feels astonishing, right? You're like, wow, this is the coolest thing ever. But then you need more and more and more and more and more to just get back to the level. And when you think of that in terms of climbing, well, what are you doing? How do your goals keep amplifying to the point where you're stepping out onto a limb, whether it's free soloing or high altitude mountaineering, where now you are potentially, well, not potentially, you're increasing your risk.
Yeah, it's like everything when I read the book. It's like everything you talk about, I just think about in terms of my own life nonstop. Because I'm sort of like, oh, it's so interesting, and this is like where we're so similar in some ways, and then we're just so completely different in some of the most fundamental ways. I think, because I think we both have had sort of similar levels of exposure to, I don't want to call it fame, but just sort of like public whatever.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, like I mean, obviously it is satisfying to be recognized for things that you've done that you're proud of and whatever, but I just don't think that, I don't think I had that I have as much of an up or as much of a down from it as you seem to have through your career, and really I think that's true for a lot of our experiences where it's like, a lot of the things that for you are both like giant ups and then lead to giant downs and whatever, I'm just like floating by at level 5,
Yeah.
I'm like, it's just like, yeah, which is also maybe contributes to why I've never had incredible creative outputs. It's like I'm not like making things and I don't know, or it's just personality.
Where do you think that stability comes from in yourself?
Well, I don't know, because that's what's so interesting is that your childhood was much harder than mine, but my childhood also had elements of sort of like where you're like, oh, I could use more attention or more stability or like a better relationship in the family and whatever. It's like basically, there's some similar elements, but it just didn't seem. And certainly a lot of my first girlfriends said that I had, a personality disorder of something. I mean, and me from like way back when. Like I've sort of blossomed into adulthood where I'm much more stable, much more well-adjusted, much more well-spoken. But as a younger man, I was definitely a little more rough around the edges and just like less. I don't know. It was all a little more tumultuous, as you'd say. And yet, it's still a totally different path. It's like, and maybe I've been wondering about this stuff more, like thinking about nature and nurture a lot, just because now I have 2 small kids, and you can't help but notice that they're just who they are, and you're just barely having an impact. And obviously, in the case of your family, there are times when family dynamics can have a huge impact on you. But even that, you wonder how much of that is just how you're born. Like, were you naturally a smart, creative person to begin with that then just wound up with some baggage around it? Or I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think, look, we are all born with different sort of mental acuities, different artistic, creative, or sort of, I don't know, intellectual predispositions. And so, we can't answer the question of nature versus nurture. And all we can do is take our best understanding and apply it through parenthood and whatever else, and how we interface with those kids. But, I look at you and I go, well, Alex obviously you have your own darknesses, and there's its own, you have your own pain that comes from childhood. And you just, for whatever reason, have learned to navigate it with more stability, right? And for me, the highs of, or the value deficit, I believe, was so profound that I thought that I needed those incredible highs to make up for it. But again, this is what I mean by storytelling, right? There is no inherent lack of value in me. And this is sort of where the book was trying to get, which is, I think there's data, which is just information. And then we interpret that data, we create a story around it that provides a meaning, and that meaning drives our beliefs. And so now we live and die by the stories that are reinforcing our beliefs without stopping to question them. We get entrenched in behavior and thought patterns, right? And so really what I'm trying to get at is, look, questioning our stories is essential, because questioning the story of, I'm not valuable, or I wasn't protected, or or whatever, or, I was a victim, all of these things. When you really like dive into it and you get really honest about it, you can start to peel some of that back and go, well, wait a minute, was somebody telling me I wasn't valuable, or was just that my interpretation that sort of became a belief? And by questioning that, can I walk it back and go, well, wait a minute, I just have inherent value. And once that happens, is it possible then to step away from the destructive behavior or the cyclical behavior that you've built as an adaptive structure to offset those beliefs or to counter those beliefs? I know that's really heady, but at the end of the day, what I'm saying is every fucking thing we do is a story. Like Alex woke up this morning and told himself a story about himself and the world and everything in it, including your history, your family relationships, your relationships with your kids. And a lot of those stories get entrenched and we don't stop to go, wait a minute, is this true? Or is this something that I can functionally alter, and will that have a different outcome?
Now immediately think, I'm like, what stories do I tell myself? And I'm like, but part of me wonders if I just don't experience like half the level of psychological, events that you do. And actually, I was just kind of wondering, like, how much of this have you learned through, like, basically through therapy or through self-work or like meditation, like reading books? It's like, because you now seem to be incredibly self-aware of your own stories, the own process of telling yourself stories. And I would venture that most people never think about the stories that they tell themselves. It's just so core to their being that they never really look that deeply. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious how, and you sort of talk about this in the book, but, how did you learn to look inwardly so well? Like how do you look into your own stories like that?
Well, it comes from a certain degree of mindfulness, and I don't want to sound esoteric or, this is not necessarily about things like meditation, but certainly they help because they provide space between the constant thought process that we actually perceive as being ourselves, which it isn't. They give you some space to step back and go, wait a minute, that's an internal voice that's just talking. And as soon as you have that space and you can go, whoa, like this is just there's a moment of pause where you can look at it and go, wait, is this true? And so some of this can be, it's like cognitive behavioral therapy, where in the way I learned that was you've got the ABCs, you've got an action, a belief, and a consequence. But usually what happens is you jump from the action or the event to the consequence. So somebody steps on your toe and you're like, fuck that guy, and you shove them. I mean, that's an extreme example. What happens in between the action and the consequence is there's a belief. And usually it's a very, very deep, simple core belief. The belief is, this guy just stepped on my toe. Well, what does that mean? That means he doesn't see me. Well, what does that mean? That means he's like, he thinks less of me. Well, what does that mean? It means...
See, this is where, because when somebody steps on my toe, I'm like, oh, that person stepped on my toe.
Right.
Like, I think like with a lot of this like mental dialogue stuff, I'm like, I think I'm just missing a few of the steps that you describe. And I think that was, one of the challenges reading the book is that I read the book and I'm like, God, there's so much going on. I'm like, is there supposed to be that much going on? Because I'm like, I just don't think I noticed that shit.
Exactly. But that's because you are more well adapted. So a neurodivergent brain is going to have all of these things going on quite often that are coming from developmental twists and turns that form the brain a specific way. So you might not relate to that. And that's okay. It's just, but people who experience this stuff, that's why it's so fucking exhausting, right? Because you're like, oh my God, how much can I think? But also that thinking allows you a gateway to deep introspection if you want to take that step. And the idea behind the introspection is finally getting the fuck outside of yourself. And that's a beautiful journey to take, but it also makes you much more compassionate and empathetic towards other people if you go on that journey, because you can look at somebody who's experiencing these things and go, yeah, I get it. I know what's happening inside your head, and I know how exhausting it is. I know how tiring it is. I know how painful it is. And I'm with you, even if that's just a psychic exchange.
We'll be back with more after the break. Element is a zero-sugar electrolyte drink mix formulated with a science-backed ratio of sodium to potassium to magnesium. Each packet delivers a meaningful dose of electrolytes free of sugar, artificial colors, or other dodgy ingredients. It tastes great, and I've used it extensively on expeditions. And my 2-year-old loves it and calls it sprinkle water. Element is formulated for anyone looking to restore health through hydration, and is perfectly suited for athletes, folks who are fasting, or those who follow keto, low-carb, whole food, or paleo diets. Try Element totally risk-free. If you don't like it, they'll refund your order, no questions asked. Get your free sample pack with any Element purchase at drinkelement.com/climbinggold. Be sure to try the new Element Sparkling, a bold 16-ounce can of sparkling electrolyte water. That's drinklmnt.com/climbinggold. I first found Coros when I was looking for a GPS watch that could track my biggest outdoor adventures. I needed something with a massive battery life that was also robust enough to handle the climbing. As it turns out, Coros is the only GPS watch brand that has done some serious development for climbers, from multi-pitch GPS tracking to indoor programmed workouts. The watches have a mind-blowing battery life. The Vertex watch series lasts for more than 100 hours in GPS activities, so I only need to charge it once every several weeks. I only need to charge my watch so sporadically that I can never find the charger, because I haven't used it in 6 weeks. If you're interested in bringing new technology into your climbing training and tracking, you should consider their new Vertex 2S. Go to Coros.com and use the code ClimbingGold to secure a free watch carabiner with the purchase of your new Vertex 2S. The link's in the show notes. I'm curious if you think that writing the book, releasing the book, talking about the book, basically this whole journey that you're on right now, do you feel like that's providing, I don't want to say closure, but helping you manage all of this better? Through the journey of writing the book, certainly you must have done a lot more research about the brain and how your own thoughts all come about and how you deal with them. Has this been a helpful step in healing? And I ask partially because I've joked with a few people over the years. Like I've never talked to a therapist, though. I'm sure I can maybe benefit from one. But I've frequently joked with friends that I've done so many interviews at this point that I'm kind of like, who needs therapy when someone's paying you to come sit on the couch and chat with them for a while? It's like, why would I pay a therapist when all these other people want me to talk about my past and talk about, and that's kind of a joke, but it's not totally a joke, because over 10 or 15 years of consistently doing interviews and talking about my past, I have definitely thought about it more and sort of, understood it a little better, understood myself a little bit better, and understood my motivations better. And so I'm curious if through the process of writing this book, have you come to know yourself better, and does that help you manage, your mental state better? Will this be a big step towards healing, or is this just a step along the way?
Well, I think, first of all, healing is not an endpoint. Healing and wounding and trauma, they're ongoing events in life. And I would say, even healing in some ways implies brokenness. I'm not going to be word police. I'm just saying, when we use that word, what does it actually mean? And so it's just an awareness around it. I'm not saying it's wrong. I think the book in many ways was it was a way to dig deeper into what I felt was holding me back, right? It felt like I was stuck. I just was stuck. I couldn't understand it. There was just this energy that wanted to get out, but couldn't, because and through writing the book, I realized, well, that's partly because I'm trapped in narratives that I've entrenched in my mind, right?
But so do you feel like you've come unstuck through writing the book?
I think that there's motion towards that. I think there's absolutely sort of a sense of, there's a sense of regaining momentum, but with a clearer picture of what that is. I know now that nothing I can do will actually make me feel whole. There's no accomplishment that will come that will actually make me feel in any way healthier.
But isn't that liberating, though, when you realize that no amount of effort will fill the bottomless pit on the inside, and then you just learn to love the pit? You're like, that's great. I just have a pit.
And all of a sudden, when you just accept it, the pit is full, The thing about all of the therapy and stuff is, again, one of the things that I've observed is people go into therapy and they go to the Hoffman Institute or whatever, and they start learning of their childhood and their trauma, right? And rather than taking the step towards healing it and just looking at it as, oh, this is a way to understand this, then they just get Then that's their new story. And for me, this was all about breaking out of the story. Even though I was telling it through the process, I was like, shit, man, I don't want to tell this story anymore. Like, even though I'm putting it literally in black and white in a physical form, I'm done with it. Like, let's put this to bed. Let's put it on the shelf and walk away. And that's, I think, if we want to use the word healing, then in that way, it was absolutely fucking healing. It was monumentally so. And it's interesting though, like you're saying how you've talked about your past for so long. It's also easy to create a creation story in there that then becomes almost like false.
Well, that's I mean, certainly as a visual storyteller, taking photos and everything, you of all people know that when you start telling yourself a story over and over, at a certain point, you're like, is that even true? Do I even remember the story? Because I have this experience all the time with like films of free soloing and things like that. You watch all you remember is the photo or the film. You don't actually remember the real experience. And then a few years later, you're like, honestly, I don't know anything about that thing that I did at some point, but it got written down by somebody and then there were some photos. And so now I remember the photos and that becomes the story that you tell yourself. Like that becomes the experience. Cause really you've forgotten the experience. It's like our memories aren't that good. It's like you really just forget all of it unless you keep reminding yourself of whatever details you think were important.
Yeah. Memory is 50% flawed. Like 50% wrong, basically. So 50% of your memories are just not true or off truth, right? And the more we entrench a story around them, the more that becomes our truth. And the more we identify with it, the more we create that identity. And then, it's so hard to break out of that. I mean, look at the identity politics of the world today. Like those are all story based on how somebody's brought up, what they're told, all of these things. And so they might be reciting history that is either false, blatantly false, or completely influenced by what they learned when they were growing up, their family stories, their cultural stories. And this can extend into racism, politics, religion. It's all about those. Yeah, it's all about the stories, and it's tragic because so much of what we experience, the conflict we experience can be at least relaxed by stepping back and stepping out of the binary storytelling, what's in psychology, what's called splitting, which is all or nothing. It's black and white, left and right and wrong. And just going, wow, it's not as binary as I think, but what's interesting is the brain longs for that thinking because it creates a sense of safety amidst a very chaotic world that we can't make sense of. So we want to anchor ourselves to something to feel safe, to create a sense of community that will help us survive, right? But in that, we necessarily create others. And in those others, we create conflict. So by trying to keep ourselves safe, we create conflict. And the idea of stepping out of that kind of storytelling and questioning stories, and specifically binary or dualistic storytelling, is not to say that we should live in ambiguity, but rather that we can create more space for many things to be true at once for different people. And I know that's hard. We've talked about this before, and in some of our going deep in philosophy around a campfire, the subjective versus objective truth. And yet so much of the world actually functions more on subjective truth.
Or just in the gray area in between things. I mean, the issue of truth aside, it's just that it's all a little gray, like so many things in life are a spectrum where you're just kind of like,
That's where the title of the book comes from, The Color of Everything. It's right at the end where I'm like, it's all gray. There is no black and white in this experience. And it's this one story is not true or false. It's just gray. Because your experience of it subjectively will be different than mine. That day, we walked up Day Canyon to shoot Conception. Like your memory of that, the shirt you were wearing, we remember it as yellow because we have the photograph, like you said. But outside of that, your subjective memory of that day is going to be very, very different.
Yeah, I remember nothing about that day. I literally only remember the image that you shot.
Which you were like, that's going to be dumb.
I know that I do remember that part. I remember saying that's going to be stupid. You shouldn't shoot from over there. And then it turned out being a giant poster for like 10 years. But that's why you're a photographer and that's why I'm not.
And that's why I'm not a climber, because
Yeah, you couldn't have climbed the crack, but I couldn't have shot the crack, and that's why we were a good team that day.
Exactly.
So with the release of The Color of Everything and Bipolar, the photo book, does this, would this mark your triumphant return to rock climbing? I'm kind of like, does this end one chapter and you'll go from writing back into sending the NAR or shooting photos or whatever else? Or
I think there's sort of a punctuation right now. There's a big question mark about what happens next. And I'm trying not to apply too much pressure to myself to figure that out immediately. Right now, I'm just focused on, hopefully making the books a success, getting people to read them, getting people to engage with them, and I'll see what happens. But there's absolutely a piece of me that longs to go back to the mountains, and specifically the Himalaya, because I don't really need to do hard shit anymore. I just really enjoy being in those big mountains, and I really enjoy being high on those big mountains. So I have no need to like prove myself that I'm some badass, but like climbing 8,000 meter peaks some people think it's just ridiculous. Climbing 8,000 meter peaks without oxygen to me is like, it's joyful. And I don't care about the lines. I don't care about any of the bullshit that people talk about. Like, I'm like, why would I expend energy thinking about it? Whatever. I'm happy people are there doing their thing, right?
You find it joyful because you're naturally quite good at altitude. You get up high and you're suddenly like, oh, I actually feel pretty good compared to everybody else who's about to die.
Compared to everybody else who's vomiting, I'm like, well,
yeah, exactly.
This Snickers tastes great.
As you slowly walk past a line of people vomiting in the snow, you're like, wow, what a nice day in the hills today.
And a dead guy or two,
exactly.
So, and photographs, I don't even care. I don't really have any desire to take more photographs. Really, I just, I did it, and I did it at a reasonably high level. I'm proud of the work that I created, and I want to investigate other modalities, other means of storytelling. I'm curious about film. I love evolution. I know some people are specialists.
But are you sure that's not just another form of self-sabotage? Like the constant changing? We're like, oh, I've gotten really good at a thing. I'm doing it really well. I'm going to start doing another thing instead.
I mean, it's a great question. And I've never really thought of it that way. But I guess the story I'm telling about it now, I don't think that's sabotage. I think that's growth. So long as I'm not doing it from a place of like, well, fuck this, I'm, burning it down, but rather like, no, I'm really proud of what I did. And now I just want to explore other things. Look, that's in my back pocket. I could pick up a camera at any point and do a successful, beautiful photo shoot. I'm not worried about that. It's like riding a bike or skiing. If you learn it, you can do it. You can do it. So I'm in a place of curiosity where I'm exploring like living in the question and being okay with living in the question and being okay with not knowing, because sort of taking my own advice of living in the middle for a minute and going, I don't need to harness some fast and hard goal, even though I know goals can be really positive for me. But yeah, I don't know what happens. I mean, it is definitely a punctuation, but every punctuation starts a new sentence. So until the last one, you know what I mean?
Yeah, until it's really punctured.
Yeah.
Until you're really done. My vote is that you pick the camera back up, you go to the big mountains, and you just do the things that you're good at. And it's like, I don't know, but I know that's I don't want to put you back in a box, but I'm just like, oh, you're so good at it, and it's so cool, and it's fun to, I don't know.
Well, and I mean, if I go to a big mountain, I'm going to take a camera.
Yeah, of course.
But it's like it's not from like, I don't necessarily want to be sponsored to go do this shit. I don't even want to get paid to go take photos. I want to go back to that place of joy that started it. And I've said this before, I'd really like to go back to the mountains in these environments to see and not to be seen. And one of the things I've noticed, and it says it in Bipolar, is like, for a long time, I spent years looking for the moment, looking at composition, looking through the camera, looking. I actually think photography in some ways is antithetical to presence, because you're not present with the moment, you're present with a frame. And so you're constantly I would say it's creative flow, but I don't think that's presence. And you know, I know this is catchy and maybe a little woo-woo for people, but it's like, it wasn't until I literally put the camera down and I just said, that's enough, that I actually started to see the world in its totality and its wholeness. And that was so fucking beautiful. I was like, how did I not notice how special all of this is? And it was because there was literally a block between me and what I was witnessing. And that's not a bad thing, but in some ways I think you sacrifice your own experience as a photographer. It's very easy to sacrifice your presence so that somebody else might step into that moment.
I think that all the time when you see people taking photos and video at concerts and things like that, or in museums or whatever, where you're sort of like, I don't think this is the time to shoot a photo or shoot video. It's like, you should just be doing the thing that you're there to do.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you need to see video, get the professional one from somebody else later. But
exactly,
you're kind of like, as soon as you start focusing on photos or video, it's like you're no longer focusing on the thing that you're supposed to be focusing on.
Unless you're a photographer, right? But like, I've said this quote before, and because I love it. And it's Guy Berg's, and he says, the point is not to show how inventive and creative you can be, but to notice what you're already a part of. And I love that because it's a way to step back and just go, holy shit, this is magnificent. Whether you call it divine or completely, you know, just a happenstance of time and physics and, you know, atomic whatever, doesn't matter. It is so shocking how stunning the opportunity to be alive is if you just relax into it. And most people, every moment, and I'm not saying there is an atrocity and there's terrible shit that happens, just saying most people kind of miss it because we're just caught up in our heads, and it's so sad because fuck, man, like, have you just stopped and looked at a flower and thought how much is required to make that fucking thing grow, from the sun to photosynthesis to the cells to the atomic structure of, like, it is absolutely mind-numbing, and everything around us is in some state of that. The opportunity to witness that is absolutely, it's, in my mind, it's miraculous. Now, mathematically, you could say otherwise, but to me, fuck math at that point. It's just beautiful.
Cory's 2 books, The Color of Everything and his photo book, The Unquiet Mind, are out now. There's a link in the show notes. Climbing Gold is a production of Duct Tape Then Beer. Alex Honnold is our host. Our production and editing team includes the talents of Lauren Delani Miller, Marco Seiler Gonzalez, and Evan Phillips. Skylar Perwins is our YouTube and social media editor. Music today by Brendan O'Connell. The tracks are courtesy of the artist. Our creative director is me, Fitz Cahall. Our executive producers are Jonathan Retzik and Ben Endy for RXR Sports, and Lizzie Hendricks and Becca Call for Duct Tape Then Beer. Thanks for listening.